welcome to this April's tea break, celebrating Shakespeare's birthday with a little cameo from the great man himself in his little wind-up toy version. He always sits and watches me on my desk. So today we are going to be answering an apparently nice and simple question, which is how far audiences travel, and we'll unpick that in a bit. But first, by way of introductions, I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and I'm a white male with blonde hair and a grey t-shirt on, with various postcards and things behind me, as well as little Shakespeare in front of me. And I'm joined by Josh, our data scientist, who's working with us from the University of Leicester. Josh, do you want to do a quick hello?
Yeah, my name is Josh Lin. I'm a data scientist at TAA. I'm Chinese with black hair, wearing a blue jumper.
Lovely, fab. And so the idea really for this session came out of some work that Josh is doing, looking at audience and audience behaviours and informing our understanding of segmentation, including looking at how far people are travelling and how we can use that to understand people's access to various different cultural venues. But we thought it was quite interesting on its own terms. So that's why we're talking about it this afternoon. So hopefully you've all got your cups of tea or other beverages handy. And let's dive in. Ah, excellent. Love to see it. So first up, when we, the Audience Agency, and going back literally decades, I think, have talked to people about audiences and where people's potential audience might be, or if, for example, someone was wanting to get a population profile report and said, well, what sort of area should we be looking at for knowing who our quotes, where our audience is from? We would generally say, really simple rule of thumb, about 80% of the audience will be coming from within about half an hour. I mean, as a rough guide, that's will generally do the trick. Of course, we can then nuance that, and experience tells us that that does flex a bit. It tends to, the catchment area will be larger if we're talking about particularly high profile events, particularly unusual events, or things which have a particularly wide following but maybe don't have lots of different individual dates, or people going to a particularly sort of prominent attraction. And similarly, if it's something which is a kind of very much more a sort of day-to-day local service level thing, you might end up with a much smaller catchment area. So for example, you expect libraries to have a much smaller catchment. It's like arena tours have a much bigger catchment, etc. in between. But that's our starting point. 80% within 30 minutes, we can then flex it in one direction or the other. But of course, we can be much more specific. And that's what we're going to do. So just by way of initial illustration, if you can advance it one further, Josh. So here we have a beautiful chart that Josh has created, which is looking at the kind of proportion of tickets sold across a set of 250 odd venues, I think, from memory, Josh, if that's right. Yeah, good. Split between venues in London and venues not in London, but you can see the kind of proportion of the audience that's coming from a particular distance. So I'm going to give you a quiz question in a second, but the first thing to note is that for both of those lines, there's a kind of a nice smooth decay with distance. So that's a kind of the general picture you will see, and that's why you get that kind of 80% cutoff. You see those dotted lines that's the 80% cutoff for each of them. And because this distance is in kilometers rather than miles, so it works out to about the kind of 80% in the 30 minutes that we would expect. So your quiz question is, which of these two lines do you think is London and which do you think is non-London venues? We've got one of them which peaks really, really early and then drops smoothly away. And you've got one which doesn't peak so early, drops faster, gets lower, and then flattens out. So I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but in your own heads, work out which one you think is going to be London. And I'll reveal the answer in 3, 2, 1. London is the blue line. So you've got a much wider kind of central area, but then a sort of a steep cut off with the London transport system, I guess. But then that line stretches out much further later on. But in general, it means that London has a bigger catchment area. So generally speaking, you can get to places from further out because the transport's better. Hence, the blue line is a bit further out. Whereas for most places outside London, you get a much smoother kind of, there's a central point and then just the audience tapers away from there. So I think that dynamic in itself is kind of interesting in terms of the shape of the picture it gives us. We'll see in a bit that has very particular characteristics when it comes to audience types. But there we are. So that's just an overall picture. But we can take that picture and we can unpick it in different ways. So we can look at it in different combinations and splits. And I know we've got in the room here today, we've got venues, we've got museums, we've got all sorts of organizations. So let's try and look at some of those differences as well. So Josh, if you just bring up our list of different things we can look at. We've seen a London, not London split there. So that's the location example. We've also got splits for different art forms, and we can also see how it's changed over time and what's happened, for example, pre and post COVID. So if you could, but just for clarity, these are based on UK audiences rather than international tourism. That is correct. Yes, that is a very important distinction. So this is essentially taking all audiences and just excluding the ones that have UK postcodes. We should probably do a session on international audiences at some point. That's a good suggestion. Josh, could you bring up the chart that shows the differences by art form?
Yeah.
So these graphics are, I think, rather brilliant because they're dynamic, and so we can zoom in on particular bits as we want to. And all of this, Josh should get the credit for because he's made all of these. But essentially, so this is showing the picture for a whole load of art forms. And could we just zoom in to 0 to 50 kilometers, just to make it a little bit bigger and easier to see? Fantastic. So it's still quite noisy. So in fact, tell you what, let's make it even clearer. Let's go to 30 rather than 50. So if we just zoom in on that bit. So what we can see here then, with different art forms available, is that green line that's really concentrated. So that's workshops. So the proportion of people that travel to workshops, it's a much geographically tighter group of people. Something similar going on for the orange, which is film. So again, the film audiences tend to be super local, I guess, because why would people travel further when they can see what's essentially the same product in one place rather than another in general. Whereas we see for things like that yellow line, the sort of yellowy orange line at the bottom, the musicals, which Josh has highlighted there rather brilliantly. Yeah, so that is much flatter for the first few kilometers, and you can see actually it ends up, when we look out towards sort of 20, 25-ish, it's the highest proportion out of that point. So it's a much more dispersed audience. As a result, we can then see these dotted lines are our kind of how far out you have to go before you get to 80% of the audience. And we can see there we've got, so film is really local. In fact, even more concentrated than workshops by the time you get to the 80% group, but they're by far the closest in. Christmas shows, again, people say super local for Christmas shows, despite the fact that lots of other large-scale theatrical performances tend to be much bigger. Children and family work, again, really local. And then we'd have to zoom out a bit further to then see all of these others where they appear. So we can see, just like that. So then you go a bit further out and you get to sort of musicals and music and plays and other art forms stretching away. So the musical theatre was something of an outlier. Oddly, is that dance is the furthest.
Yeah.
And then sort of dances the right way out, which I guess is probably because, coming back to the thing we started with, very specialist product. So you've got kind of big dance houses like Sadler's Wells, etc., in London, or the Place. That's an offer that isn't necessarily easily replicated elsewhere. So you do end up with a much sort of wider spread of audience. And just to give you a heads up, later on in the session, we'll sort of, we can experiment a bit with some of these if you've got very particular questions about particular audiences or particular art forms or things you want to sort of, you're interested in from your own point of view. So get ready to ask particular things if you want to. But we can see essentially that we are seeing quite a huge variety really in the distance traveled by art form. So that's really big difference. But if we go back to the slides, Josh, we can also see that there's a difference by year, and we're going to come back to that in a bit. And the reason we're going to come back to that is that we've got a curious little mystery, at least I think it's a mystery, that we're going to kind of explore by looking at some of this information. So can you move us on again? So our mystery is, we have got not only this data in terms of booking data from audience answers, so these hundreds of organizations, their actual transactions, we've also got data from the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is across a big sweep of the population, where people have told us directly their attitudes to various different things. And some of those relate to where people attend events. So if we can move on to the next one. So we've asked people across different waves of the monitor, different questions about geography and where people go. And we've seen quite a consistent broad trend. So we've asked people, compared to 5 years ago, which again puts us neatly back into the kind of 2014 back to 2019 in terms of the date range we're looking at. Are you going to a wide range of places or a narrow range of places for everyday life and for entertainment and leisure in general? And sure enough, we're seeing people much more likely to say they've the range of places they go to has decreased. So it's about 10% difference for entertainment and leisure, 8% difference in everyday life as a kind of net figure. So people are telling us that yes, by and large, people are going to fewer places. We've had previous waves of the monitor that have told us that people have become more conscious of places local to them throughout the pandemic period, that they're more interested in staying local, that they ought to travel as far. And when we asked people a year earlier, before wave 11, over the next year, how do you think your travel will change based on the cost of living? Again, really large portions of people saying, well, actually, to cut down on fuel costs, we expect to try and stay more local. So there's loads of things telling us that people should be traveling more locally now than they used to be. You can probably see what I'm setting up here. Over to the next slide. This doesn't necessarily build the same case exactly, but I just think it's quite useful contextual information. We asked people how often they go out of their local area for culture. And this is the wave in between the two, so 6 months earlier, so that would be last April. But people are saying essentially, it tends to be relatively infrequent that people leave their local area for culture. So people are generally saying, yes, it's, we stay local when we do cultural things. So people stay local, they think they're getting more local, and they don't want to travel because of cost of living. So that you would think would mean that the average distance traveled should have decreased since the pre-pandemic. And indeed, that is what we have been telling people. And it is what I believe is true, I should probably say. And yet, Josh, if you could advance us on and take us back to, well, take us to the one which is looking at attendance for different years. And here we will need to zoom in. So here we've got our London and not London figures again, and you can see that's the biggest difference, is that London and not London is notably different from each other. But in as much as there's a difference, so the, where are we? So the, which, oh gosh, that green on grey is really hard to read, isn't it? But 2017, non-London is further out. and it has got, the peak has got lower, and therefore it's actually flattened out. So if you look at the dotted lines, so you've got the 2017 dotted line is there, but then by 2024, the dotted line is actually further out. So people, it says, are traveling further in 2024 than they were in 2017. Okay, this is obviously not great news for my theory. Similar thing with the 2017 and 2024 for London, where you see actually there's a bigger difference. And if you look at the left-hand side of the chart, you can see that we're not talking about radical changes, but nonetheless there is there's a drift in terms of where people are attending. So the question is, why is this the case? Why are we seeing this in this set of data when we're seeing something different from the survey data? And indeed, when we start to, I've spoken to lots of people across the sector, and people are talking about audiences being more local. It's not just us saying it. So why are we getting this picture? So can you move us on? So we look at the two, what's going on? So we have some hypotheses. First question, and I'm partly doing it this way so you can see the thought process we tend to go through with the data, because I thought that might be kind of an interesting way of looking at it. So the first hypothesis, first thing you want to check is, well, is the data wrong? So Josh, if you just move us along to the next bit. So, it's possible. You always have to think about it. We know the sources of the information. We know that it's, the audience answers data. It's a big sample. It's a good spread. We've checked that. It's consistent. We're not comparing different venues, so that should be pretty reliable. On the survey side, we know it's nationally representative. We know it's it matches other data sets we've had. It looks like it's kind of in line. So hopefully we'll think, okay, we've checked it. The data's probably not wrong. But going next down the list, is it showing different things? Is there something missing? So the participation monitor data is showing the proportion of people in the population that are saying certain things. The transaction data is showing us the proportion of tickets that are doing different things, or people's tickets that are doing different things. So it could be the case that we've got lots of really frequent people who are skewing the picture one way or the other. So people are really highly engaged. Maybe they are traveling further than they used to. The big population in general are traveling less far, but that group in the ticketing data outweighs the other. It's possible. So that, I guess, would be one theory that we would want to check. And I'm just going to see what we've got in the chat here. So we've got what is defined as London. So this is the London region. So it's the area of London that you'd have for the definition of the mayoral election, as opposed to specifically transport zones, if that makes sense. And in terms of our 80% catchment area, I think that takes you out past Staines, but not as far as Windsor, if that gives you quite a specific kind of breakdown of it. Fab, it looks like the other questions have been answered. Is it that our data is showing different things? So we think to some extent it is, but I suspect there's something more interesting going on. So I think that probably both things are true, but they're true because of an interesting effect which we would otherwise miss in the data. So Josh, this is where we've got differences by subgroups in the data, and because those subgroups are behaving differently and they're also changing, you end up with a kind of an overall effect which goes in the opposite direction of the effect you see more specifically. I believe, and I'm happy for anyone who's a more advanced statistician than me to correct me, but I think this means we've caught in the wild something known as the Simpsons paradox, which isn't actually based on the Simpsons TV show, but I quite like this diagram, that basically shows that you can have a correlation in one direction for all the subgroups of a set of data, but the overall correlation for the whole group can run in the opposite direction. So in this instance, we could have subgroups, all of whom tend to get more local. And so when you ask them, they tell you, yes, we're going more locally. And yet, in aggregate, you end up with behavior that's going in the other direction, and people are traveling further away. And that's one of the things we're going to try and unpack now about why that might be happening. So we have differences by art form, as we've already briefly touched on, and we've also got differences by audience profile. So if let's zoom in on this one in particular. So this is showing, this was showing and it's now moved. Can we go back to Spectrum, Josh?
Yeah, I think this is the one, is it?
That's the one, lovely. So this is showing for each of the spectrum groups, the proportion of them that are coming for each particular distance. So by and large, it follows the same overall shape. People tend to be much more likely to be really local, and the drummers drop away. But what you get is particular bulges or dips at different points for different segments. So for example, experience seekers are really, really high as a proportion within the first couple of kilometers, and then it drops down very substantially. So essentially, that group are all really bunched. So you can see that if that attendance levels by experience seekers changes, then your audience will become more or less local. And that's just about who's in the audience, not about the actually overall behavior otherwise, if that makes sense. Similarly, we can see, so pick out that one, so that's metroculturals, again, really high locally. These two groups really high in London, notably, but again, drops down a bit further, although you get a bit of a hump a little way out for the metroculturals. So it's just about sort of 8 miles out or so. We have, but we won't share it here just for the sake of not dizzying you with too many charts, but we could separate out London and not London for this as well. So if someone's curious, we could look at that. But essentially, you can kind of see there's this big, huge cohort of this group, particularly in London, and about that far out from London, you get quite a lot of them, about sort of 8 kilometers out, and then it sort of drops away. On the other hand, you'll see some other segments right at near the bottom. So the dark blue one, which is commuter land culture buffs, is the most spread out of the segments. So they're by far the lowest proportion at the local area end. They're the highest proportions you get further out, and they've got the highest average distance of people attending. So you're beyond 30 kilometers by the time you get to 80% of that group attending, compared to barely over 10 for kaleidoscope creativity. I think that one is. No, metroculturals. So you can see really big difference in terms of where these segments are relative to cultural venues, and therefore if the proportions of these groups fluctuates, which we know it has done over recent years, then you're going to see a bit of a change. However, that's made more complicated because we've seen slight drops in metroculturals, we've seen bigger drops in commuter land culture buffs, home and heritage, and I think we've talked about this in a separate event, but we've also then seen some of the groups in the middle increase how often they attend, and so you're getting kind of distortions of this distance picture at both ends in terms of the segment mix. So you could it's quite a complex picture. It's not just that the distant ones have dropped off or whatever, but nonetheless, the net result of these shifting segments is that you end up with people looking like they're a bit further away on average, even though individually each person might be saying, yes, I'm more inclined to stay more local than I was. Does that sort of make sense? Wonderful. At least one person nodded. I'll take that. We've also got a difference in that we've got those different distances traveled for different art forms. So Josh, if we go back to that one, which I know we've already seen, but the art form one, which, yeah, lovely. Ooh, we seem to be missing our earliest kilometers on that one. Yeah, oh, there we are. Okay. So if we were to just isolate, if you wouldn't mind, film and musical theatre, and so lose some of the other ones just to make it really obvious what we're looking at.
Musical theatre.
So really different picture between these two art forms. So film is really, really localized and then drops off heavily. Musical theatre, much higher portion. And of course, although the gap between them doesn't look very big, you can see that actually the distance to get out to 80% is vastly higher for musical theatre. And that's just because those small percentages over, dozens of different kilometres, each one counting up a little bit higher, actually that's a massive difference. So if we have a situation, and in fact, it could be that film's not the best comparison. Sorry, let's pick something like, I think dance was quite local, wasn't it? Fairly local, not super local. Well, the key thing is if you have a shift in the art form mix, and we're seeing people, for example, programming less dance recently, programming, relatively speaking, more musical theatre, then the distribution of the audience will push towards more musical theatre will mean that the audience will push sort of further away, if that makes sense. In some cases, cultural venues are programming more film, in others, they're programming much less. So that's a bit of a mixed picture. But essentially, change the audience mix, change the art form mix will also change the distance, even though at an individual level, people are saying, I'd rather stay local. What we're also seeing, which probably plays into this, is a drop in the frequency of attendance of audiences. And so it could be that if people are going less often, but every now and then they go further afield, it still feels like their life is staying much closer to home. In which case they may kind of report, when we ask them surveys, where do you tend to go? Well, I tend to stay close to home. It's just that a lot of those more sort of casual, regular cultural engagement moments where they wouldn't travel as far, if those get whittled away, then on average it goes further away, even though people's inclination hasn't actually shifted to be traveling further, if that makes sense. Essentially, people are incredibly complicated is the long and the short of this one. But what we can do is check this against other sources of information to sort of sense check it. And for example, if we look at Department for Transport data and say, are people reporting that they're traveling more or less than they used to, or for leisure or entertainment or things, we're seeing there again that the number of miles traveled per year for entertainment and leisure is less than it used to be. So that again is a broader trend that would back up our kind of initial hunch. So what this would lead us to is thinking that if we want to understand the specific behavior of an individual audience for an organization or for an art form, whatever, we probably do need to zoom in quite carefully on, let's look just at those particular audiences, that particular art form, because some of these big picture trends may be being driven by all sorts of other things which aren't necessarily kind of blurring the picture for that particular context. So if you have an art form that has a really high proportion of groups that tend to live further away, so for example, we saw commuter land culture bus, home and heritage tends to travel, relatively speaking, further, dormitory dependables as well. So that would mean something like, let's say, orchestral music might tend to have a more dispersed audience. And indeed, we've seen some of that in the other data. So that's my hypothesis for what's going on in this data. So we've got some particular indicator figures. So, as and when you revisit these slides, you can see these particular proportions, these particular distances for different art forms, different people. But I'm also quite curious about whether you have either comments and reflections and experiences about how you think your audience is behaving and whether they're traveling further or not, or specific questions if you want us to explore the data live together. So does anyone have any reflections on this? Does this match what you expect? Does the complexity of it fit with your thoughts, or does it all just seem a bit befuddling? Is there anything you'd like me to explain? What do you think?